Everyone, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all wherever you are at this session of our AI Tech and Policy Talks, AITPT. And for those of you who join us for the first time, AITPT is an initiative of our Digital Law Center, which has the mission to present and discuss cutting-edge issues dealing with the multiple aspects of AI tech and policy. And today it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Padmashree Gehl Sampath, who is a senior advisor at the Global Access in Action, so the Gaia program at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and a great pleasure also on a personal level to reconnect somehow with the Berkman Klein community. And Padmashree is also adjunct professor at the Department of Social Sciences of the University of Aalborg in Denmark, and as well a professional fellow at the UN University. And she will speak today about the very important topic of artificial intelligence and structural inequality. And she will particularly discuss the problems of foreseeable and unforeseeable bias. And as we've done in the past for the previous session of our AITPT events, the presentation by our speaker will be followed by comments on the presentation that will be made by two distinguished commentators. And today it's a great honor and privilege to welcome our two commentators who are Professor James Wahutu, who is assistant professor in media, culture and communication at New York University. And we're happy and very pleased and honored to welcome you, James Wahutu, today. And we also have as commentator, and that's our second commentator, Professor Jean-Henri Morin, who is Associate Professor for Information Systems at our own University of Geneva, and who will be our tech expert today. And we will then open, as done in the previous session, the virtual floor for a discussion with our speakers, as well as with our commentators. Please note that this session is recorded and will be made available online so that people who could not attend today will have the opportunity to watch it. And without further ado, let me now wish you all a very stimulating AITPT session. And let me now give the virtual floor to Dr. Padmashree Gehl Sampath for her presentation.
Thank you to Professor De Vera and his team for this seminar, and I'm really thrilled to have Professor James Wahutu and Professor Jean-Henri Morin as the two panelists. And my presentation is called AI and Structural Inequality, and I titled it, when I was writing it, I called it Foreseeable, Unforeseeable Bias and Other Things. And so as I speak, I think I'll get to the other things, but I thought that just foreseeable and unforeseeable bias just doesn't cover the spectrum of issues that I'm going to talk about today. So just to give you a little bit of a background, in my presentation, I'm going to look at how AI is unfolding in the Global South mainly, where a lot of my projects have actually focused over the past several years, especially since joining the Berkman Klein Center in 2018. I'm going to look at the main categories of AI expansion in low and middle income countries, then move on to see what we observe on the ground, and then raise questions on what it really means for digital governance. Next slide. So we see particularly three categories of AI expansion in the developing world. The first one is the big tech foray in low and middle income countries. And this has been receiving a lot of attention in the media and in policy debates. Next slide, please. And basically, one thing that's happening and has been happening for several years now is that big tech has been using developing countries as a bedrock for expansion into newer and newer things, apart from just being platform companies. So for instance, when Facebook decided to move into digital payments and more widely the financial sector to break the competition basically from PayPal in the US market, it actually targeted a large developing country, which is India first. Amazon did the same thing in Brazil for electronics, and you see companies like Alphabet using emerging markets then to get into healthcare. You also see other tech firms that really sort of focus on expanding their reach and making themselves sort of like prominent players by focusing on emerging markets like Microsoft Azure, cloud computing, and Accenture for cost-effective AI solutions. Next slide, please. Now, you also see a lot of new companies really sort of emerging and going into newer areas like fintech, and fintech especially has been expanding exponentially, both at the global level and also in emerging markets. So here is a company called Kiva, which for instance launched a blockchain platform for financial service industry in Sierra Leone. It's basically plugged into multiple agencies of Sierra Leone through a sort of a Kiva Protocol. Okay, which is supposed to help actually poor people get loans and prove their credit history. Next slide, please. Then you see a second category of firms, which are basically firms that are either local or international, but they offer sort of dedicated applications in specific sectors like medtech, fintech, and other areas. Next slide. So in medtech, for instance, here's an example of a couple of companies in India where I'm running a project. So for instance, here you have a company which is looking at AI-powered solutions for detection of cervical cancer. Next slide. Similarly, you have companies which offer actually software with machine intelligence for, to detect breast cancer probabilities, or retinal image analysis for glaucoma. So what you see in these contexts is that you see actually small companies mushrooming with a combination of software applications or AI-based sort of applications that plug into healthcare support structures, but they're not entirely connected to mainstream healthcare delivery systems in these countries. Next slide, please. Then you see a big set of companies which offer future forecasting. So for instance, this already started in 2012, 2013. So the graph you have on the left slide, for instance, is about wealth, that is wealth mapping in Africa using mobile phone data. So basically in this context, you have analysis of how people buy airtime and what it tells us about their socioeconomic status. And with that, you can start forecasting about how people are going to emerge with their consumer demand, what kind of products can be sold in these markets, and what can you expect basically in terms of economic baskets of opportunities for foreign firms to invest in Africa. In the same way, there's another company in California called Atlas AI. This is something done by Atlas AI, for instance, which is basically taking all the data that's available, plugging loopholes, and trying to forecast growth in asset wealth in these countries. Next slide. More generally, you also see that there's a lot of companies that try to fill in existing service and product gaps, which can be a result of either governance failures or sort of really just market failures. So in Africa, over the last 2 years, if you follow the trend, what is happening is that you have a lot of business-to-business trucking marketplaces that have emerged to connect shippers and carriers across Africa, because infrastructure coordination is a major problem for industrialization. You also have firms that try to offer savings and investment possibilities in low-income communities, like crop insurance or savings management for farmers using distributed ledger technologies and so on. And then you also have firms which which offer sort of medical supply chain management to sort of like guard against counterfeiting of drugs. And in these cases, you see that these are local firms and they succeed because they focus predominantly on local problems, and they have a deep knowledge of local markets. So they understand really what is not working and where is the service niche where they can plug themselves into. And then they have access to some local data that they can build their enterprise model on. Next slide. So this is, for instance, a company which is very successful in Africa doing that. It's called Pedigree, which is, this is one of the first companies that actually developed a cold chain quality validated solution system to prevent fraud or counterfeiting of drugs and vaccines. And this company has now expanded across Africa, and it's also expanded beyond the pharmaceutical sector to offer solutions in agriculture and other areas. Next slide. Then you see a third set of initiatives. Basically, these are public sector initiatives run by governments, or these are sort of like supported by donor agencies or a wide range of international agencies which are trying to use or facilitate the use of AI for the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. Now, one of the major things that you see in this context is, digital IDs. So the World Bank, which has actually promoted the use of digital IDs in a large range of developing countries, estimates that 1.1 billion people are unable to prove their identity globally, half of whom reside in Africa. And proving identity is really important because otherwise there's an exclusion in terms of healthcare, sanitation, housing, education, and finance. Plus, they're also not counted in the way economies perform. And to solve this problem, biometric identification programs have been suggested repeatedly or promoted through various international agencies. Since the start of COVID-19, this trend has actually accelerated much more because it's been sort of like under the guise of financial inclusion and catering to poverty and access to healthcare. Next slide. So the good news, let me start with the good news. Of course, all of these are sort of interesting ventures in the sense that they provide services that have been hard to access previously in low and middle income countries. And even when they're not entirely based on the creation of new knowledge, they promote new business models, or they create new markets, they create new businesses, enhance productivity rents. They also help to streamline supply chains and improve quality, and they also can promote participation and inclusion. Next slide. But how does it look on the cost side? So moving away from the benefits to think about what's really happening on the ground. So what I did in a couple of my projects is, since 2018, is to look at how do the kind of failures in artificial intelligence design and implementation of the kind that we tend to discuss when we talk about AI regulation and AI ethics, how do they materialize really in developing countries? So this debate tells us that you can have foreseeable bias and unforeseeable bias. So in the case of foreseeable or intentional bias, you have machine learning, which is meant to achieve a certain result. But it sort of like is used then in context where it sort of aggravates exclusion or marginalization. And you can also have unforeseeable bias, which emerges from the opacity of the AI system itself, which is neither transparent to the user or the innovator, in the sense that the machine learns, or the algorithm learns over time, and then just generates connections that it was not intended to generate. Next slide, please. So both of these happen to quite a large extent in countries and so my projects, they look at it largely in countries in Africa and India, in Asia. So I'm only looking at one country in Asia, which is India, and in Africa, multiple countries. And what the evidence shows really is that there are sort of like intended effects which are largely ignored or muted in the way AI is applied. And unintended impacts, or sort of unforeseeable bias, it can also occur, and it's much more immediate in terms of exclusion, or much more severe in terms of promoting inequality in LMIs, in low and middle income countries, because social and economic inequality is very deeply embedded structurally in these countries to a large extent, because it's really sort of, these are sort of highly unequal societies in the way that they've historically emerged and developed. And AI is basically interacting with social constructs which are very old, and AI is not cognizant of the impacts of these exclusions. Next. So on the ground, what is happening? So the first thing, let's look at, for instance, the cost-cutting efficiency promoting AI. So I have a project ongoing in India, which looks at COVID-19 induced use of fourth industrial revolution technologies in the context of India, okay? We plan to expand it, but we've been stuck in India because it's so fascinating what we're seeing there. So what are the key findings? So at the macro level, you see that, you know, AI has been used over the last few years in a wide variety of sectors in order to sort of like cost cut and promote production efficiency. And it has had two impacts. It has increased the skill levels for the sector, and it has also increased actually the employment, especially for IT consulting, okay? But it has had a significant impact on employment in a negative way, streamlining business outside of the IT consulting services, okay? So firms have been promoting AI applications in all other sectors, retail, manufacturing, finance, etc. And since the start of COVID-19, this has become even more severe. So what you see is that IT consulting has expanded, and the cost-cutting measures have also expanded in all other sectors. So what it is doing at the meso level in the Indian employment market is that it's creating employment vulnerability and increasing pressure on employees. What is this pressure on employees? Two kinds. A is to reskill themselves on their own at their own expense, and B is to be ready to find new jobs. And at the micro level, within firms, it increases gender biases. For instance, a lot of people that we interview talk about how, you know, women can't spend enough time on the job. They have limited capacity to contribute. So when jobs are getting cut, they prefer to have men rather than women. So it plays on structural vulnerabilities because of the high skill requirements and enhances exclusion in labor markets. Next slide, please. So on the ground, also in the case of private sector operations, what we also see is that developing countries or low and middle income countries, they're trying to enable local firms to perform better in different sectors. But when local firms emerge, then not many of them have very strong data control agreements or arrangements with the government. So local firms tend to use terms like, oh, you know, we are engaging in evolutionary contracting, and we embed what we learn into the code itself and so on, which is quite reminiscent of the AI ethics debates in the US and elsewhere, but we're not paying enough attention to this, okay? So, and this helps the proliferation of more and more applications without much accountability. So in the Indian education system, AI is being widely used right now. And this AI is being used in a way that actually it promotes the inclusion of elitist schools and elitist communities into the education system in a better way, but it actually fosters the exclusion of marginalized communities who have already historically found it difficult to access education in India. Next slide. Then AI also preys on the increasing vulnerability of the user, especially the really poor communities, which depend on financial inclusion, which is promised through digital biometric methods. Now, and we talk, for instance, in the West about, choice of the user to opt in and opt out. And in the context of low and middle income communities, you really have to ask the question, what is the choice when the option to opt in is only theoretical, right? Because in the case of India, for instance, the unique ID program or the Aadhaar program is mandatory if you want to benefit from something. So this opens poor people and poor communities up to experimentation by private firms. And here I have a picture of the Kiva Protocol that's developed by the company Kiva, which is now actually being promoted in collaboration with UN agencies for application to many other countries. Next slide. It also leads to the rise of the political private sector in developing countries in a very significant and strong way, something that we're not discussing with the attention it deserves when we talk about governance of AI at the global level. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One thing is that historically we've looked at technology as a means for development. And this is something, that has been sort of like, propagated in all development debates for the last at least 50, if not 100 years. right? So the question of technological change is central to industrialization and development. So a lot of policymakers in the developing world have a techno-solutionist bias, right? So governments often view all technological change as good technological change. And this is where the problem comes with AI regulation. Because when you give access to data coupled with the power to set standards and create applications, you know, political power is not just with the governments, it's also shared by the firms. And you see that the missing clear boundaries that specify what is allowed and what will not be tolerated often offers too much power to tech businesses and leaves citizens open to new experiments. An example is Free Basics, where Facebook created its own version of the internet and introduced it in 28 countries in 2019. And this wasn't questioned either by governments or by civil society in these countries, but it led to a sort of pre-selection of information for the people. Next slide. And there's a close link between public and private sector activity in low and middle income countries. For instance, biometric ID systems, governments are implementing this, but it's a highly lucrative private market. This market is expanded from 18 billion into 2018 and it's expected to go to 44.7 billion in 2022. But it's not the governments that are creating the biometric ID systems. It's the private sector that provides these solutions. So there are a few players, like German company Mühlbauer has projects for digital IDs, passports, and digital tax cards in a wide range of African countries, including Uganda, Sudan, and Congo. Next slide. This is, for instance, the map of how many countries in the world are using AI surveillance technologies today. And this is from the Carnegie Endowment Trust. And they are having a project and they have an AI surveillance index. And it gives a lot of information on what is really going on in the developing world, because a lot of these technologies are being used by governments to implement surveillance of different kinds to aid in law enforcement, but a lot of these technologies are not tailored to the social context of these countries. Next slide, please. So for citizens, what it does is it creates a lack of transparency and recourse. So you have the opacity of firms, which is something we discuss routinely in the AI debates, but you also have the opacity of governments, right? So the AI surveillance index that I just spoke about shows that at least 75 out of 176 countries globally are actively using AI technologies for surveillance, right? But then, you know, who is surveying? So, you know, there are people being surveyed, but there's also a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that countries such as China now are emerging as major players in the surveillance area. And, you know, Ariane Shines have a really interesting paper coming up, and Jeffrey Ding is working a lot on this topic as two scholars who are really doing really cutting edge work on Chinese surveillance technologies and digital authoritarianism from China. And they argue that Chinese exports are not only its technology, but it's basically used to promote interoperability between low and middle income countries and then the Chinese digital infrastructure. And this technology is linked to large Chinese companies, of course, which are part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Next slide, please. So can it be resolved? How can we resolve this? So right now in low and middle income countries, the focus has really been on digital industrialization and digital infrastructure, and then data localization in order to protect against cannibalization. But what you see when you go through this is that there's a significant policy disconnect between how you locate data within national boundaries and how you enable its use with particular attention to data's personal, social, and economic relevance. This is something which has received very, very little attention in developing countries. So low focus on personal privacy protection, and then there is also a lack of full implementation of personal privacy protection acts, right? And this leaves users vulnerable to not just racial, ethnic, or other uses of their data, but it also creates ample confusion on when businesses can use data, how they're using data, how long they can use the data for, and what recourse do you have in that context. So we did a I did a project where we tried to look at personal data protection laws in developing countries and how many of them really offer recourse and actionable, apparatus if you feel that you have been wronged. And this data shows that although about 80% of developing countries now have actually implemented these laws, within the laws, actually personal privacy is really sort of like the language used is a bit like the GDPR. A lot of the provisions reproduce parts of the GDPR, but they don't really provide a means to implement privacy. They don't really give recourse to the user. Next slide. So what is not dealt with in these frameworks is that this unequal control over data itself is a pervasive form of digital equality, right? It has ramifications for economic development and human agency. So if you just take digital industrialization and you equate that with normal industrialization and you start working on skills, enterprise development and so on, it's not enough. You really need to focus on how do you solve the unequal control over data. Then another thing which is not dealt with in these contexts is data management. So how do you manage personal and non-personal data? And what do you think about benefit sharing, social responsibility, and accountability? Data storage and stewardship is also not really resolved. So for how long, by whom, where, and until when? And oftentimes when I work in the field and I sort of look at what's happening between firms and governments, you also find that government allowances to manage data are different for different players. For example, in Tanzania, we had a few cases, but you also see this now in a lot of other countries. Next slide. So there's a need for clear standards, right? So if you're going to give better facilities to local firms and you're going to give them access to data to local firms without rules, then you have to also know that there can be changes to ownership. Local firms can be eventually acquired, and this puts at risk personal data of your citizens. And that's something that's not clear. There's also internal confusion within countries on data ownership and use. For instance, again, in the Indian case, in the use of AI in the education system, large international companies are working along with local companies, and they all have projects on artificial intelligence in education, but there is not much clarity on who has ownership on the data collected or whether there are limitations to its use. Next slide. And a key issue is owning the narrative, which has not really happened. Owning the narrative in the sense of what is digitization, what is digital industrialization, what kind of data governance do we want to have, and how does actually digital sovereignty look in the context of low and middle income countries, and how do we really think about privacy in the context of the South, right? And to own the narrative, there is a need to move forward towards promoting data use, right? So which models help to solve the problem of unequal data control, and how can we pool data to use and reuse in a transparent manner? Two is to look at digital industrialization in ways different than conventional industrialization. I've just talked about it, but there's a lot of connection between technology infrastructure, interoperability, data portability, and data governance and industrialization in the digital economy. And these interlinkages have not yet been given the kind of importance they deserve in sort of domestic debates in a large variety of low and middle income countries. Then there's also a need to look at increasing transparency and legitimacy of datafication of services, right? So why collect data? Why have AI? Is AI good in all cases? What is the purpose and how will it be used? And what are the guarantees against arbitrariness, right? The problem right now, and a lot of my project results point to this, is that data localization leads to a focus on technocratic developmental strategies where the state actually becomes the arbiter of digital rights. And this is very problematic. Then there's a need to acknowledge the changing boundaries of state-citizen relationships, which is connected to this fact that if the state is the arbiter of digital rights, how do you sort of like make sure that the state is actually enforcing all the constitutional guarantees? Next slide, and I think that's my last slide. I'm not going to go into this now. This is a slide on solutions. This is from the other paper that I'm working on. And I'm looking at how the solution of government as a platform that is combining legal and technological solutions, help to balance the promotion of open standards, help with greater interoperability, data portability, and help states in the global south to experiment with alternate models, right? We can talk about it if there are questions. Next slide. And I think this is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much. I look forward to the comments and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation. And I couldn't help but thinking about the EU regulations. So your last line was perfectly well received in my mind, because I really thought of all the sectors that were covered by the AI regulation, including education, biometrics ID, employment, and all of that is extremely important. And it's also covered by what you call the high risk AI system. So your presentation was perfectly in line with what I was thinking of, which was really this AI regulation in the EU. Thank you very much. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Dr. James Wahutu. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? I know it looks strange, yes, because I'm on video somewhere else and I'm talking on a cell phone. Thank you. This is a testament of the internet in the US where everything keeps on freezing. So I figured I'd just call in. Thank you so much, Padma. This was a great presentation. And I admit that I am biased, right? Because I generally love your work. But I think some of the topics you kind of dived into are really interesting. And I was particularly interested in thinking through this idea of a political private sector, right? Because, you know, we almost start seeing this in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, right at the end of the Cold War with the introduction of the structural adjustment programs, right? Late 80s, early 90s. But in the context of our conversation today, I think we start seeing it even that much more rampantly at the turn of the century, where in a conference in Osaka, Japan, one of the biggest debates is how do we bridge the digital divide? And how do we make sure that these masses that are dislocated from the internet have a way to kind of participate in this new thing we're building? And one of the conversations is, well, we need to privatize the telecommunications industry, which then meant that a lot of companies that were coming into Africa to kind of build the infrastructure were often coming from the global north. Not only were they coming from the global north, but African countries were essentially paying rent for them to do this, right? So these countries were paying rent for them to build the infrastructure, while also at the same time, these companies were benefiting by the charges they were charging people to kind of come into the sphere, right? So when we start thinking about what we're now seeing on the AI side, right, and how these players have become not just political actors in the regular sense, but have become states, right? In the understanding that they are producing services that the state can and should be providing for its people. We see this long lineage, right? And that then raises the question for us, at least, who study Africa or live in the continent, what do we do, right? And how do we sort of navigate this space? And I think that's a twofold problem for Africans, as you've probably seen and written about and read, right? Because we always find ourselves contending with these policies that are framed and written and debated not on the continent. So these states then come through and they're essentially being told, if you want to play in this arena, these are the rules you need to abide by, right? So they're not participants of the policy framing process in that sense. I was at a Twitter space yesterday and somebody was kind enough to remind us, and they said, look, what we have to realize as Kenyans is we're just the users, right? So they don't care how this plays out, provided they're able to get their revenue. We just play in a tiny sandbox with these rules and tools that are designed outside. And what does the conversation need to look like? And this is where I go back to my sociological roots, right? I go back to early 1902, where Max Weber is giving the keynote at the first German Sociological Association. And in this keynote, one of the things he says is, he structures the keynote around this idea that sociologists needed to study the press, right? And needed to study the press, and lays out a roadmap as to the questions that we need to ask the press. And I think part of this, which is why I really like your paper and your work, is we're almost taking that push to study the press and saying, this is how we study AI, this is how we study technology in the global south, right? And we look at it not necessarily as redemptive and as this is the way to industrialize and we will skip all the other stages, but as what are the problems that are not being articulated in these spaces that these policies are being framed. So rules and regulations written in the EU, phenomenal. Do they make sense in an African country? Maybe not, right? Because as you said in the paper that you shared, there's a big difference between theoretical possibilities and practical viability, right? So if we sit here and we're saying, well, you could always opt out of these platforms and you could always opt out of these programs, not necessarily when the state is pushing biometric IDs, when the state is tying you being a citizen to you having a biometric ID. The notion of being able to identify is phenomenal. But if you live in a state where the state is authoritarian to begin with, biometric IDs are some of the worst possible solutions for anything, because the state could easily come in and find you and trace you and surveil you and ensure in a very specific way that your rights and freedoms and your rights to dissent politically are curtailed in very specific ways, right? And not only that, the state will ensure that the goods and services that you see, you have access to when you move around the country are easily countered by the state, right? And the other thing you mentioned that I really like is the companies benefiting from this are again in the global north, right? So I think at some point, there has to be a conversation as, is a biometric ID worth it, right? If we're giving all of this data to this amorphous company that is not answerable to us, right? Us being the citizens, is it worth it? And how do we talk about these technologies and these policies in a system where the African state is a mere middleman and is rent-seeking, right? And they're looking at the biometric ID program as a way to get money from the global north to do whatever it is they want to do, right? We saw this with Kenya's Huduma number. We saw this in Nigeria's digital ID program, where they were essentially scams. That is what they were, right? Because the government needed money to sustain an election. They got millions of dollars, and we still do not have these IDs. And the courts in Kenya say that these IDs were unconstitutional because of the amount of data they were asking. Kenyans were being asked to provide DNA data. For what and why, right? But if you look at the state as rent-seeking and as essentially a data broker, you understand why they want the DNA data, right? Because they want to sell it and make a profit and move on. So even as we talk about these debates, even as we talk about these policies, I think there's often the risk of looking at a state as being altruistic. We have to start from the state is not altruistic in a lot of African countries. That is not it. The state is a business seeking to make a profit from its citizens, and through that profit, seek to swing elections, right? That is what the state is doing. And the state has learned to talk about the language of digital privacy, right? To talk about the language of blockchain and efficiency. This notion that the state needs to be efficient is a crazy notion, right? The state needs to provide goods and services to its citizens. But this conversation of efficiency allows it to tap into a Google, to tap into a Microsoft, to tap into a whatever and say, look at what we're doing, give us money. Your Google, your Microsofts, your Facebook want this because it's more data for them, right? So the conversation then, and this is what I like what I like about how you ended, the conversation then begins okay, let's rethink the notion of what is privacy in these spaces? What is data in these spaces? What is ethical and ethics in these spaces? Because what is ethical in Switzerland may not be ethical in Arusha, right? Why? Because while it may be ethical to gain consent and to provide informed consent, right? About this is what you're giving us, this is how we're thinking about privacy. If you don't re-articulate privacy for the person in the village in Tanzania or Kenya, right, then you're not talking about privacy as they understand it. That then cannot be ethical, right? Providing a terms of service that theoretically somebody signs onto, while the term of service is in English, is in French, is in Spanish, and the person in Kenya speaks Giriama. They're not going to sign that knowing, fully consenting to what they're doing. They're going to sign it on the understanding that I need to do this to get to X, right? And how do you get to X? A Facebook will come in and give everybody $3 to sign up, right? A China Huawei will come in and give everybody and say, look, we will give you a free phone if you buy one, right? So people in your house have a phone. But what is the hardware and the software doing on that phone in these particular spaces? Right? And this is what I like about your project, right? Because you disambiguate this notion of, yes, these things is theoretically possible, but is it viable in these spaces? And how do we need to rethink viability, right? How do we need to rethink these questions that we seem to take for granted, right? How do we need to rethink this idea that global connectivity is a human right? What does that language allow us to erase, right? What does it allow us to force people to do, right? And to kind of wrap up, again, being the sociologist that I am and being the media sociologist that I am, in 1963, there's a conference in Ghana, and Kwame Nkrumah is talking about the role of an African journalist, right? And one of the things he's debating and talking to journalists about, Kwame Nkrumah being, you know, a former journalist himself, he says, what is not only the role of an African journalist, but who is an African journalist? What makes a journalist African, right? And he says, one of the things we have to realize is that maybe this notion of rapid privatization may lead to the media putting profit above this sense of nationhood, right? And a lot of people read that as, well, he's trying to be authoritarian. I often have to remind people, this is the 60s. The notion of being Ghanaian is new, right? The notion of being Kenyan is new. It's less than 100 years old by then. And he challenges journalists to not impart these notions from the global north of what a journalist could be, but think about what a journalist was in post-colonial Africa, right? And think about, in the same conference, there's somebody else that says, think about what education allows you to do, right? Not just the education you gain in the global north, but how is it relevant in Ghana, in Kenya? And I end with this to point out that these conversations about AI and ethics and big tech, right, are often premised on understandings outside of the global south, as you said. And they're brought in and everybody says, this is what we do. And for us working in these particular spaces, I think we need to rethink why this is what we do, right? Is there a different way to say this? Is there a different way to push back? Do we need free basics from Facebook? Or do we need Google's Project Loon? Do we need these things? And why do we need them? Does having a biometric ID ensure that that person in Kapenguria gets 3 meals a day? Because if it doesn't, then this is an nonsensical conversation, right? Because if we're not ensuring the bare minimum, 3 meals a day, healthcare, and healthcare that works, right? And education, and the possibility to dream about the future, and the possibility to participate in the institutions of democracy, then why do we need it, right? And if we think it will make it better, how can it make it better in Kenya, right? Then we think about the DRC, because, you know, DRC's global biometric tax card is a fraud. we know it's a fraud, but they got a lot of money for it, right? And I think these are the things that I loved about your presentation, because you're challenging us to think about these questions from a different perspective, from a different epistemology, right? And going, I see what we're doing in the EU, but the Tanzanians are having a completely different debate, right? Even debates about data localization. If your infrastructure is owned by France, it doesn't, what is localization in this sense, right? What is, you know, as one of my favorite authors, Nanjala Nyabola, says, what does it mean to have a democracy that is digital and a politics that is analog, right? Because lives are affected on the analog side of this debate. The digital democracy bit, yeah, that's for the outsiders. That's not for us, right? And if the locals understand this, policy experts have to understand this, academics have to understand this, and realize that that divide right there is where, and this may sound weird for me to phrase it this way, but that is where the fun is happening. The divide between the digital democracy side and the analog politics side. That is where good research can be done. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much, James, for these very stimulating comments and thoughtful comments. As time is running, I perhaps just wanted to give you, Padmashree, the opportunity to briefly react perhaps on one point before then, of course, we can open up the discussion, because then obviously we have to move to our second commentator, and that will be Jean-Henri Morin. Padmashree, do you have a short comment and reaction to make, perhaps?
Very short, yeah. Thank you so much, James. And I mean, so much to think, but one thing that you hit bang on is this question of a digital democracy and the politics behind the digital democracy, right? Because what I find working in these countries is really nobody is questioning why biometric IDs and why are we tying all the services to biometric IDs and for whom are these markets and why are we opening up these markets? Because the data then is with private firms. The main providers of these solutions are global private firms or the Chinese state, which is then trying to provide digital infrastructure for that, or other countries which are then trying to enter into the foray, because there is a struggle for digital dominance internationally. So, and I think that if we don't unpack that, and if we don't say, okay, we're going to provide the biometric ID system, but we're also going to equally protect the users, then we are really missing something. I mean, case is India. We don't have a Personal Data Protection Act in India until today. And everything is in the biometric ID system. So, thank you.
Thanks very much. Let us now turn to Jean-Henri Morin for his comments on Padmashree's presentation.
Thank you very much, Jacques, and thank you very much, Padmashree, for this very inspiring discussion that you're enabling today. I really discovered your work through your writing, and it was very, very interesting for me. And I would like to start maybe with a few thoughts that your talk and your writing suggested me. Maybe one of the first thing that struck me is that I wonder if you would agree on saying that eventually, I mean, this was inspired by what you wrote, data protection and privacy to some extent could be or could act as a proxy to the AI challenges that we're facing today. The levels of maturity are obviously very different. And, or in other words, what can we learn from the path that we took internationally on data protection and privacy, and to see how this can shed some light on the AI challenges that we're facing today globally. So that was kind of this first thought that struck me reading your work and considering eventually that notion of data protection and privacy acting as a proxy to AI. Maybe we could leverage that in some way. Then there's something also that I found very interesting that I actually discovered. I'm not very familiar with the north-south I would say, decomposition of affairs. And I lived in Asia for some time, and it brought me to look at two things. The first thing is that how do we relate to the cultural impacts that regions have on these debates, which are highly global. And, you know, having lived, I lived in Seoul, and I had a lot of interactions also with people in China and Japan. And it's striking the impact of culture on how we look at some of these problems. And I have the feeling that today, a lot of the approaches in terms of governance are trying to find something like a one-size-fits-all approach, or, you know, what are the holy grail principles, you know, that everyone would agree upon, that would save the world and everybody would be fine. Turns out that it's not going to be that simple. Just take this issue about, you know, surveillance, privacy, data protection. This is highly cultural. And our approach, which is, you know, we're grounded into some form of, you know, almost in our DNA in Europe, looking at our heritage around liberty and, you know, and autonomy and these things, we're very much attached, you know, to privacy and data protection. But if you go to Asia, the thing is very different. I'm not specifically speaking about China and the social credit system, although it is a little bit enlightening on that matter. But the collective dimension that we find in Asia is very different culturally from our approach in Europe, which itself is different from the approach that we would find in North America, for which I would say a buck is a buck, right? So, you know, we could talk about things, but at the end of the day, it's worth $1. I'm willing to get it or to give it. It's fine. We can have a deal. So we have these kind of three, I don't know if we can call it cultural differences or doctrines. I'm not sure about the word I'm using here, but eventually it's very different in Asia, in Europe, and in North America. So that was one thing that I was looking at. And then reading your work brought to my mind another dimension, the North-South dimension, which is a totally different issue. So if you're looking at horizontally like that culture, now vertically, I don't know if it's the right words again, but whatever, it's not that one is on top of the other or whatever, but maybe we're looking at North-South in terms of more an economic issue. And this brings a second dimension to the problem. So, and I'm wondering to what extent these two dimensions are interesting as some kind of a lens also to be applied to this kind of issues and research. And eventually I'm wondering if there aren't other dimensions eventually, this kind of cultural, horizontal, the kind of economic, more economic dimension is maybe there's an other dimension. So that's a question that reading your work also that struck me. And another thing which I've been very excited about recently, and if you look at the global debate on these issues surrounding AI, everybody is talking about ethics. Everybody. It's all over the place. It's in all academic papers. It's all in all initiatives. It's all about ethics. Now, the problem I have with ethics, I have no problem with ethics. I mean, it's a great area, but when it comes to enforcement, ethics is strongly tied to culture. And the example I gave before, if you look at Asia, Europe, or North America, you're going to have very different mixed feelings about ethics. Probably looking at North-South, you will also have different feelings about it, probably. Now, if we ought to do something which has impact, and this is the thing that struck me recently, I would rather talk about human rights than ethics. And I think there is a slow shift which is happening these days where we're moving from ethics to human rights. And human rights are interesting because they're legally binding to some extent, right? You have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have treaties, it's more actionable than ethics. So this is also something that I wanted to throw into the discussion because it kind of resonates with this kind of east, west, north, south thing or dimensions. And also something that you mentioned in your writing, in a couple of places you talk about, and it's legitimate. I mean, you talk about the data economy. Now, this is something which I would think today is the worst thing we can talk about in terms of the damage that we are making to the potential way of solving many of these challenges. If you talk about a data economy, you basically capitulate on the notion of use or autonomy of people with respect to their data. Now, I know it's all over the place. Everybody is talking about data economy. It's, you know, it's the new oil, it's the whatever, and you get all this kind of mumble jumble everywhere. We definitely must break this idea and move towards a data use economy. And if you move towards a data use economy, then it's a whole different world, because you force large corporations to break their business models because their old business models will not work anymore. And so again, this is if you assume that the business model side of the issue is a major problem, which I personally think it is. I think we have a problem there with the business model. This being said, this leads to some kind of what I call the too fat to change problem, you know, or some form of economic cynicism. These companies, there's nothing to be expected from them, nothing. They can claim whatever they want. They can say whatever they want. They can go to Congress. They can testify. They can argue around self-regulation, whatever. It's never going to work. So we have to find other mechanisms, other approaches than leaving this in their hands. And this is where I would kind of tie what you're talking about to something that I've been working on a little bit on my side, which is digital responsibility, and in particular, corporate digital responsibility. If you look by analogy, you know, 25 years ago, people were kind of laughing about social responsibility. It was kind of, you know, mostly a PR argument. Nowadays, corporate social responsibility is baked into the financials, right? These figures are assessed and they make it, you know, to impact the bottom line of companies. And I think today, I've been working a little bit with the Ethos Foundation here in Switzerland, who is pretty active in this area of social responsibility. And they were curious in integrating something about corporate digital responsibility to their assessments. They basically provide analysis to public pension funds. So what I mean by this is that if we are to attack the equilibrium that I think evolves around digital responsibility, which is basically composed of industry, governments, and people. You know, if you break it down to simple blocks, if you want to act on the supply side, you're going to have to tackle where it hurts, and that's the money. How do you tackle the government side of things? This is more complicated. It's harder, and it's even harder when I hear James before saying that, you know, basically governments in Africa are businesses. You know, this is scary. We have a high expectations, you know, for governments and, you know, governance in general. So and democracy, and then this whole equilibrium should be worked towards sheltering people. And this is where things kind of go into play. So I don't know if the money can play a role for governments too, I guess. I'm not sure about this. And what else? How can we, you know, what are the leverages that we can use towards basically moving this, making momentum in transforming the attitude? And I think the business model side is very important here. In this notion of digital responsibility. So I've been working, I'll send you maybe the information. We've worked on a kind of a digital responsibility index that we kind of framed into AI also, because it was an easy shot for us at the time. But basically this notion of a digital responsibility index is something we're working also with the Ethos Foundation. So I think I've expired my time. There's always a background question I have in my head. Is there anything useful, such as you know, a World Digital Organization? I don't know, the usual remedies. I have no idea. Maybe it's a very bad idea because UN. It's good, it's bad. We don't, you know, we don't really know. But what does it take nowadays to tackle these challenges that we have? They're really rough, but I'm an optimistic person, so, and I really enjoyed reading your work and listening to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Henri, for your comments, and it would indeed be great if you could share perhaps on the chat what you've done with the Ethos Foundation with respect to the Digital Responsibility Index.
Sure.
I'm sure, Padmashree, you may want to react to what Jean-Henri has just commented upon.
Jean-Henri, thank you so much. So I just want to say something is that from all of this work that I've been doing, right? So I've tried to break it up into 3 or 4 new levels to look at the questions rather than sort of north and south and horizontal sort of cultures. One thing that I'm doing is looking at this issue of technological dependence, because some countries globally have always been technologically dependent on other countries. And this now translates into a sort of a technological dominance automatically, and whatever comes from the US or other countries is viewed as something beneficial for the rest of the world. And how do we sort of like tinker with that narrative? How does one really change the culture of thinking around that narrative? The second one is this question of when you talked about business models, you know, global and local. So the digital economy, because it sort of plays into a hyper-globalized world and this whole discussion on digital trade and everything going from being analog to digital, there is actually this disconnect because you have global firms, they can pick up data from anywhere, go scouting for data anywhere, and they can have business models in any way, but they don't need permission from local government or local people to collect the data on them. And this is sort of crazy because this doesn't fit into the way we look at globalization and globalized trade and what can we do about it. And the last thing I'm trying to look at is this link between technology and inequality, because technology has always been unequalizing, but it has never been as unequalizing as it is now. So what does this tell us about sort of socially beneficial technology, and how do we sort of like, you know, regulate it? How do we decide as individual societies what is technology that is beneficial for us? Because that's a debate I think that should be relegated to governments, to collective consent. And even in this issue of consent that we have for the data economy, we don't have a discussion around collective consent. Nobody is saying, let's have a discussion about this.
Thanks very much, Padmashree. Anyone from the audience wishing to join in with comments, questions. This is conceived as an open forum for discussions, debates, not only between the speaker and the commentators, but of course to open to everyone who would have an interest to join. So I've seen Dino, and then Lubna Rashid, Dino Vazovic.
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation, Dr. Padmashree Sampath. And excuse me a lot if I don't pronounce it well. And thank you also to the panelists that really underline some really interesting problematics. And for me, I was interested most of all in inequalities and technologies, the part that was talking about it, because I was interested if you saw in your research in India, for example, or other parties of the world, maybe where you went, a way where those AI technologies increased the inequalities in the doing of the technology. I mean, because when you talked about minorities, that was even more minorated through, for example, women that can't go into this, that can jump in this business because of all the problems that you mentioned. I was also curious about the fact that maybe in parts of the world like Africa or South America, the algorithm used to make the technologies more efficient will be even more invasive in those parts of the world because it's free, because we give you the technology, and like this, we can take even more data and we can go even more in your privacies than in the European or North part of the world, or you didn't like had the occasion to see some things about it?
Padmashree would like to react. So just so that you know, and I'll invite the next people to speak, to just briefly introduce themselves. Dino Vazovic is with us at the Faculty of Law, the research assistant on our team. Padmashree would like to react.
Yeah, sure. Dino, thank you for that question. And the answer is yes. So for instance, if you if you take that map on surveillance that I showed before, right, in my presentation, you will find that, large parts of Europe are not using those surveillance technologies, right? But they're made in Europe, these surveillance technologies. A lot of the firms that actually are actually manufacturing a lot of the surveillance technologies are based in France or Germany and European countries, but they're not used in those countries because they have very strong data protection laws. They're very strong laws against personal surveillance, okay? But they're being used elsewhere. And this brings me to this issue that James raised, right? Because what happens if states are not accountable and they become sort of middlemen or conduits between technology companies and people, right? Okay, and they expose you to a certain level of surveillance which you didn't sign up for, but you have no choice to reject. And you've got to do it, or it's because it's part of a biometric ID program, or because it's part of a financial inclusion program. There are cases, for instance, that I found during my work, or also it's been documented by other people, that digital passports have been used against certain communities in Africa, in Asia, right? Digital biometric identity system in India is not exactly free of discrimination. It's not guaranteeing you that your data is not going to be misused by the government. In fact, there are many cases where the data is being actively misused by the government. So what if, so it's not just private firms that you have to be worried about that they're going to get your data, but what if the government itself misuses your data? And in the Indian case, there have been massive data leaks reported. So who took the data? Where has the data gone? And what's the recourse to the user? So these are sort of really disturbing things that are going on in the South. I mean, and what Jean said, I think it's really important in the sense that he talked about, my point is, data protection being a proxy for the AI challenges. And I think that there's sense to that. There is a sort of an underlying argument in my work which points towards why you need to data protect. For instance, if you data localize because you want to data protect, you're better able to cope with these disadvantages than you data localize just because you want to industrialize, okay? And that's not working. That's something that my work is actually showing, that countries that just data localize because they want to industrialize don't manage to create the right regimes for that data use. Whereas countries that want to data localize, like in Europe, because they want to protect personal privacy, they seem to be able to better prepare against these high risk applications and better prepare against bias and better prepare against lack of accountability.
Thank you a lot for the answer.
James, would you like to react to that? Because there's another question by Lubna Rashid. James?
Yes, just quickly. So in my day job, I studied genocide and mass atrocities. And one of these countries where I do this work, one of the things that I've noticed is Google came in and gave people digital addresses, right? And they sold it as this is good, blah, blah, blah. But the thing was, the people didn't necessarily sign up for it. The state signed up for it. So one of the biggest fears right now is the state has this new added layer to find out where people live very explicitly and also arrest people that are political dissidents, right? Because there's nowhere to hide in this country. And that's the thing that's been concerning. Or the other one is Safaricom's M-Pesa that everybody praises around the world. What Safaricom started to do was to offer loans, short-term loans. And then because you have a Safaricom number, Safaricom then decided that they will have access to your contact list. And then Safaricom starts calling other people, right, when you start defaulting on your loans and start charging other people when they pay for their airtime, right? So we're starting to see these things show up in these very specific ways that are creating sort of new ways to marginalize people, but also to target them in very specific ways.
Thanks very much, James. Lubna Rashid, if you can briefly introduce yourself and then make your comments, your question. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thanks for this very, very inspiring discussion. I am a postdoc at the Technical University of Berlin and also a research fellow at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society, also in Berlin. My research is at the intersection of entrepreneurship, AI, technology, and sustainability. And most of my research so far has also been in fragile country settings. Currently I am particularly focusing on the MENA region and the use of AI, for sustainable or unsustainable outcomes, whether socially or ecologically in some Arabic countries. And some of the things I have been observing in my work is that a lot of the issues that were mentioned, that you mentioned in the discussion and the presentation were, of course, very applicable in that region as well. But there's also a couple of nuances here that I find very interesting. First of all, when it comes to data privacy, many people I have spoken with whom I have spoken, they realize that, of course, there are issues with data security, but they also don't care. So there is a common narrative about why should I care about my data being secure or not? We have bigger problems to think about. I don't care who has my data. What does that even mean that my data is public or that people can use it? Well, I mean, the government has surveillance over us anyway. Like they really don't see this as an issue. And for me, I'm still, I'm really curious as to what degree is this coming because of an underestimation of the issues that result when data is not secured, or and how much is this because of simply really not knowing but not caring, because there's just a different concept of what data security means, or how important is it to have your data secured. This issue is valued differently. I lived between personally between Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon and the US and Germany and Croatia. And so in all of these places, there have been very different values of data privacy. Germans are crazy about data privacy versus the US is like, and Arabs don't care at all. So I'm wondering, yeah, maybe you have some comments and thoughts about that as well. And I also had another comment, which is a completely different one, maybe. When you mentioned issues with bias in AI related to gender bias, to media selection of the information shared with people, also the latest study I did was with German AI startups, and we also saw that AI startups contribute quite positively to economic SDGs, but not at all or even negatively to environmental and social SDGs based on regression analysis that we did. So what I want to say with this is that many of these issues are also very common outside of fragile countries or developed countries or whatever help we want to classify, or like, let's say, low resource environments. So these issues are basically everywhere with AI right now. What makes it special when we talk about these issues in countries in the global South, for lack of a better terminology? Yeah, so I guess these are the two umbrellas of comments that I have. And thank you so much for the discussion.
Thanks very much. Padmashree, would you like to react?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Luba, for that. So two things. You talked about, I think you raised very important points. I mean, one thing is that when people say, I don't care, so to a large extent, most times, they either don't know the extent to which this data matters, okay? Or they have really sort of dire needs that make them weigh this data and its protection differently. So for instance, when you work with really very poor communities who need to be financially included or who rely on mobile phones for certain activities, okay? Basic services, for instance, they're now being delivered on mobile phones and sort of like devices like the mobile phones, then they have to make that essential trade-off. And then, of course, you know, surviving, being alive, getting paid, and sort of seeing through the next few days and having sort of those benefits are more important than the sort of distant evil of somebody keeping your data and doing something with it, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is that in my work, when I work across companies and communities, what I also find is that it matters whom you talk to. So it matters if you're talking to for instance, in the firms, young people are more keyed into what does it mean for your data to be used, worker surveillance, what is actually happening in terms of misuse of employee data than older people. Okay, so in a lot of sort of low and middle income countries, so the older people are not fully aware of what all these technologies can do and what's going on behind the scenes, for instance, with the employers. Okay, so that's something that's an information gap. And, you know, I think that Germans are hyper aware of what's going on because Germans are hyper informed, right? And, you know, so information is also very important. And these countries, people don't have the kind of information and the kind of debates that we see happening elsewhere. So, and that's one of the things where, you know, a homegrown narrative of the kind that I mentioned in my presentation is really important, to really start talking about what are the costs and what are the benefits of these technologies and how can these affect us, right? The second thing is what makes it so special in developing countries or these environments. There are two things that make it, in my view, really, really special. One is that, actually three. One is that these are contexts in which you have low institutional accountability already, right? So there's very little recourse, there's low institutional accountability, and there's low institutional capacity to oversee these technologies. So in some contexts, for instance, when I spoke to policymakers, it's not that they didn't care, they just didn't know at all about the fact that this data can be misused. They didn't know about it. They were not informed. And even if they came to know from me or anyone else, they didn't have the resources to allot to that kind of stuff, right? So these are so we are talking about countries that have historically difficult, institutional contexts, and they're not well endowed. And the second thing in these countries is also policy coordination in developing countries is a big issue, just beyond the digital economy, general policy coordination for industrialization, between industrialization and social outcome has been a very big issue. And this whole issue of AI comes into that, right? It comes into a situation where you have low resources and weak institutional accountability. That's another thing that makes it very specific. And the last thing that makes it really important is that, I've looked at industrialization experiences of countries for a long time, right? Which is sort of my main area of work outside of the digital economy. And there you see that industrialization doesn't happen if you have increasing social inequality. And Jean-Henri mentioned the case of Seoul, right? South Korea. It's a classic example. When you industrialize, you have to bridge the social gap slowly, right? And if you don't manage to bridge the social gap, you have adverse industrialization outcomes. And this kind of AI and these intrusive digital technologies, they increase these social gaps. They aggravate actually economic inequality in countries because they build on already existing, caste or community, religious, ethnic biases that actually economic development processes have sought to overcome for the last 50 years. But now we are sort of regressing. And that's what makes this so special. And if you take that in the context of low institutional capacity and difficulties to oversee and account for, then you really have the confluence of very difficult circumstances in low and middle income countries.
Thanks so much, Padmashree. There is one question, I'm not sure whether the author of that question is still with us, and that's Gianfranco Moy. He put it in the chat function, asking, and of course, under his control, if he wants to intervene live, but if I read aloud the question, which is, in addition to culture and economics, a dimension that I believe is also important is the age proxy for familiarity, understanding of digital and AI in particular. And the question is, what's your take on that? Padmashree, any take, or James and Jean-Henri, of course, but you, Padmashree, first.
Yeah, no, I just mentioned it. Age really matters. So the young people are more aware and more involved in these things. They know what's going on and they seem to be more informed, even within firms and outside of it. So, age, I think, really makes a difference. And I think the only way to bridge that age gap in sort of like understanding of what is wrong and what can happen when digital technologies go wrong is really sort of, is to inform and educate. I think, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have huge problems explaining to my father, this can happen and that can happen and somebody can surveil you like this and this data can be misused like that. So, age really matters.
And sorry, but just to add to the age thing, I find this very interesting because specifically in older population segments, I find it in low resource environments, as you said, there is maybe some nonchalance or some sort of relaxation as to what technology can do because they don't see the dangers, versus in the European context or the German context with which I'm involved, that particular age segment is particularly the most scared of technology and all the data, all the data privacy issues around it, and so I'm quite curious as to psychologically maybe from environmentally, contextually, what factors contribute to that difference. Maybe that's a research question for the future.
No, that comes from this long-standing association as technological change as something positive, because this is what they've been sold. For developing countries, advanced technologies are positive, So when you sort of introduce new technologies, there is a sort of openness to adoption because it's seen as something that will help you,
Yeah.
And that is sort of, that's something that narrative needs to be influenced. That's really important.
Thanks very much. There was another question, but more questions about resources asked by Pierre Laurent on the chat to you, Jean-Henri, about documents on digital responsibility, but I assume that this is now addressed because you already shared documents on the chat, which are, of course, of great value. Is there any questions or comments or reaction? Perhaps the last opportunity to our speaker as well as to our two commentators to share a final thoughts after this very stimulating session. Padmashree.
I will give the chance to my two commentators to speak because they have so many valuable things to say. I just want to thank you. Thank you, Jacques. Thank you, Anna. And thanks to James and Jean-Henri and all of you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. James, any comments?
Yeah, I was actually also going to respond to Lubna's question. I think it's always important to remember a country's collective memory and what a country has been through in terms of state surveillance, in terms of violence. And this may account maybe for those instances where an older generation is a bit more worried about technology than the younger one, right? Because there's this thing that happens that everybody remembers. At one point, we were sold thing X, and it ended up in terrible, terrible ways. And we will guard our privacy with immense jealousy, right? Whereas a younger generation may not have those problems. And they're just like, look, this is where we are. And we tend to see this in those countries that have undergone massive, massive instances of violence and human rights violations. There's often, the generation gap tends to look very different, depending on whether you actually experienced it or whether this instance was a story you were told, right, across generations. But, you know, so I think that may end up explaining some of those things. But I think, generally speaking, I think Padma's talk has kind of evoked some new questions, which for me is always a sign of a good talk, right? A new way to kind of think about old and new problems, but also connecting the new problems to older solutions, right? Rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So, you know, for me, that's always a fun time. So thank you so much. And I actually really enjoyed listening and hearing the extent to which your work had kind of moved forward from the last time we were speaking about these issues.
Thanks very much, James. Jean-Henri, any
just like to thank you very much for the invitation and for the chance and the opportunity to discover Padmashree's work. I hope we keep in touch. I'd be really interested to follow up on some of the discussions. The point you make about education is absolutely central, I think, and digital literacy is a highly unaddressed issue globally. We're not all equal on that matter, but I think it's a huge leverage that we have here, and something should be done about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It's time to wrap up, and I'm very happy as organizer of the session because it's exactly on time. It's 6:30, so it's perfect. As we know, the discussion is certainly not over, but this is really the essence of AITPT, and I do hope that we'll have other opportunities to continue our discussion, hopefully have other speakers join in. Please do let us know if this could be of interest to any of you to kick off these stimulating discussions on this highly important issue. For now, let me express our deep gratitude to our speaker, Padmashree, Gehl, Sampath, to our two commentators, James Wahutu and Jean-Henri Morin, as well as to all of you for this great session. And last but not least, also to Anna Andreevich, with whom I've been organizing these AITPT sessions. So we very much look forward to seeing all of you again at our next session of AITPT, about which we will communicate shortly online. So thanks very much to all. Have a good evening for those of you who are located here in Europe, and for all of you, a good rest of the day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.